I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's October 1st, and we have a lot to talk about. I hope you've been able to listen to some of the ECTRIMS Extra conversations that we've been releasing over the past week. They feature some of the key presenters at this year's ECTRIMS Scientific Congress, giving you a personal synopsis of their ECTRIMS lectures in easy-to-understand English. There's more exclusive ECTRIMS content to share with you, and you can look forward to a whole video series as well. But with all of this focus on MS research, I thought it might be helpful to add some context, and that's what this week's episode is all about. Introducing some context that will make it easier for you to absorb and process all of the news coming out of ECTRIMS and the rest of the MS research that we're always talking about. I think you'll find that a lot of the research taking place and being talked about falls into a framework that we've been talking about on this podcast since 2020, and that's the Pathways to Cures Research Roadmap, a roadmap that leads to 3 types of cures: stopping MS progression, restoring lost function, and ending MS forever. Now that research roadmap has received its first update. So right before I left for Copenhagen to attend ECTRIMS, I had an opportunity to talk with the National MS Society's Vice President of Global Initiatives, Shawna Golden, and the MS Society's Executive Vice President of Research, Dr. Bruce Bebo, about how the Pathways to Cures research roadmap has been refined and enhanced. I've already heard from many of you who've told me that you enjoyed my conversation with Bruce that took place right outside of the conference center, literally minutes after the ECTRIMS meeting came to an end. Well, I'm devoting this week's episode of the podcast to Bruce and Shawna, who I think do a great job of walking us through the updated Pathways to Cures initiative, explaining where we are, and how this global research roadmap is effectively resetting the world's MS research agenda. A couple of weeks ago, we reported on the release of an updated Pathways to Cures research roadmap. Joining me to talk about what that means and where we are when it comes to the progress being made in MS research is the National MS Society's Executive Vice President of Research and the lead author of the paper that describes the refined Pathways to Cures research roadmap, Dr. Bruce Bebo, along with the National MS Society's Vice President of Global Initiatives, Shawna Golden. It's always special for me to have old friends join me on the podcast. Bruce, Shawna, welcome back.
Hey, great to be here, John.
Yeah, thank you for having us, John.
Bruce, some members of our audience may have started listening to the podcast more recently, so I'll start by asking you to explain what the Pathways to Cures research roadmap is.
Yeah, so this really is inspired, John, by the progress that has been made in the understanding and treatment of MS over the last years, and the feeling that we're at an inflection point, an inflection point in our quest to find cures for MS. And that feeling that we're on the cusp of actually curing MS, what inspired us to chart the Pathways to Cures research roadmap. And the goal of the roadmap is to establish a clear vision of the areas of research that hold the most promise to get us closer to cures for MS. And the document, the manuscript, identifies gaps in our knowledge about MS. It identifies some milestones and some specific actions that will speed the development of cures. Now, the original roadmap was developed with input from a lot of different stakeholders. It included the Society's National Board of Directors, our Scientific Advisory Committee, a whole host of scientific and healthcare provider, thought leaders, experts, and hundreds of people affected by MS. And it took a couple of years. I know you were in some of those meetings, John. And we subsequently, since publishing the original manuscript on pathways, collected the endorsements of over 30 global MS advocacy professional organizations. And that version was published in 2022. But we always intended this to be a living document. And last year, we assembled about 200 global MS experts, healthcare providers, payers, policymakers, funders, and people affected by MS to review the scientific progress that have been made since we established the scientific foundation of the roadmap, to develop the sort of guidelines for a refined roadmap. And that refined roadmap was published just recently in the Multiple Sclerosis Journal.
So I'll ask you one more clarifying question. Why are you referring to cures in the plural? Don't we just need one cure for multiple sclerosis?
Yeah, so one of the things we learned, John, one part of the sort of fact finding as we developed the original roadmap was engaging, as I mentioned, hundreds of people living with MS. And we asked the question, what does a cure mean to you? And what we learned was it depends on where you are in your journey with MS, what a cure means to you. So if you're at the very beginning of your journey with MS, boy, wouldn't it be great if I could take a pill or get a shot or have an infusion and stop the disease in its tracks and never have any more signs or symptoms of MS. That would be a cure for someone at that part in their journey. But if you're a little farther along in your journey with MS and you've accumulated some disability and your life is impacted by that disability, that wouldn't be enough. You'd want to reverse those symptoms and turn the disease around. And so that would be a cure if you were at that point in your disease. If you have children and you're worried about the future and you want to prevent MS from happening in the first place, which we all do, obviously, then preventing MS speaks to you. And so we learned, again, depending on where you were in your journey with MS, what the definition of cure meant for you. So that's why cures is plural, because there are multiple cures. And of course, I think it would make sense to almost all of your listeners that there are going to be multiple ways to get to those different cures. So that's how both the pathways is plural, because there are multiple pathways, and why the cures is plural, because there are multiple cures.
So tell me, what's new in this updated research roadmap?
Your listeners may or may not remember that there are 3 pathways in the roadmap. There's STOP, and that stopping the disease, which is defined as no new disease activity, or however you measure it, whether you're measuring it clinically by no new symptoms, or whether you're measuring it by radiologically through an MRI, or perhaps even through blood biomarkers. There's restoring function, and the definition of restore is to restore activity and function. And then the third pathway in the roadmap is as end or prevention of MS. And so in regards to the STOP pathway, in the refined roadmap, John, the opportunities for stopping the disease really happen right at the first indication of any involvement of the central nervous system. So all the events that start at the first time the central nervous system is involved, that's where the STOP pathway really begins. And what's new, I'd say here, is this appreciation that there may be this prodromal phase of MS. So the prodrome is a period of non-specific symptoms that precedes the diagnosis of a disease. And we're learning that MS has a prodrome. We're learning what some of the characteristics are, and we can start perhaps through looking at interactions with the healthcare system, or potentially through biomarkers or imaging markers, can start to identify people that may be in this prodrome or preclinical stage of MS, and perhaps be able to start using a disease-modifying therapy or strategy in that very earliest phase of disease, before sometimes even clinical symptoms become apparent, be able to stop it before it gets started. So I think that's an element that's new. Another objective in that pathway is really about precision medicine. This is really, I think we're understanding better what the biology that's driving the different types of MS or different stages of MS. And that's revealing targets for therapy. And perhaps, some of your listeners may have heard recent news of, at least we know the top line data from fenebrutinib that showed it looks like it's working in secondary progressive MS, and secondary progressive MS in people that don't show any kind of inflammatory activity. And so that would be an example of understanding that biology that's driving that type of MS and developing a treatment that addresses that biology. Regard to the restore pathway, again, this is about reversing symptoms or recovering neurological function. And in this updated roadmap, those opportunities for restoring function begin once the MS-specific clinical symptoms arise. So once you get diagnosed And of course, that ability to repair extends all the way through the course of the disease. And I'm thinking, John, as we understand what the early phases of MS are and identify it, that this is going to shift ever earlier on the tactics for promoting myelin repair. We certainly feel like the earlier you use a repair strategy, the more effective it's going to be. So many targets that are being explored in myelin repair clinical trials, testing those. We've repaired myelin in humans. We just have to be able to show the clinical benefit for that. And that's really, I think, one of the major highlights right now that we're honing in on, is trying to demonstrate the clinical benefit for that. And then the other objective in the restore pathway is really using rehab to leverage the nervous system's ability to rewire to natural plasticity that all of our nervous systems have to compensate for the damage. And so there are recommendations, John, in that section about enhancing the quality of studies, focusing on prehabilitation. That was a really interesting concept that we discussed about deploying rehabilitation strategies before you need them, right? People do this in hip replacements or joint replacements. They get you strong before you have that hip replacement so that it's easier after the replacement to recover from it. That's an example of rehabilitation. So that concept is starting to emerge and is described in the pathway. And then in the end pathway, which really is about prevention, there are really two opportunities. So that the first opportunity is preventing MS in the general population. So there's a trigger or triggering event that happens and a series of events that happen after that trigger. So can we disrupt that triggering event? Can we prevent that event from happening? And an example, of course, people are probably familiar with is Epstein-Barr virus infection. It may be an important trigger for MS. So could we develop and use a vaccine to prevent that exposure and potentially reduce the risk for developing MS? I don't know. We're going to hopefully find out. So that's sort of what's in that objective. And the second one is really about preventing clinical disease in people who are at high risk for disease. So we're getting better at identifying people who may be at high risk through a combination of genetic profiling, of blood profiling, of medical history, and identifying people who may be at high risk for MS and deploying some type of prevention strategy in that population is, I would say, another part of the end pathway that we're focused on. I'd say the other aspect, the real addition to this version of the roadmap that wasn't really developed so much in the first one, was just the recommendations for enhancing global collaboration, global coordination among all the stakeholders in the global MS movement. So the roadmap really calls for more strategic, more global approach to supporting research, a way to reduce duplication. We think that will lead to new insights into cures for MS. Resources, of course, are not infinite. The roadmap calls for better coordination of research investments by funders. We think we can enhance the collective impact of all of our investments by better coordination and collaboration. The manuscript calls for establishing global research priorities and coordination among funders to just assure that our resources are focused in the right place. And there's a lot of emphasis in this version of the roadmap on implementation. It's something we don't think about. So it would really be unfortunate if we developed a new therapy, whether it's pharmaceutical or non-pharmaceutical. We got a new diagnostic tool or a new imaging tool, but for financial reasons or technical reasons, people with MS can't have access to it. So the roadmap calls for better, earlier engagement of policymakers, early engagement of payers, so that access to those treatments happens in a timely way. And finally, the refined roadmap points out that the center of all of this has to be the person who stands to benefit most from the progress we're making in research, and that's a person with MS. So we emphasize in this document that the global MS movement must engage people with MS at every level of research. And it also points out that we have to do a better job of engaging people from underrepresented groups in the design and implementation and participation, both in fundamental and clinical research, so that when we have those strategies and we have effective treatments, they're generalizable to everyone affected by MS.
Shawna, let me ask you, in 2023, during the Pathways to Cures Global Summit, MS organizations from Australia, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the MS International Federation declared their commitment to create a collaborative framework and work together to accelerate research progress. So it's been a bit more than a year. Can you tell me what that effort looks like today?
So after the global summit, as you mentioned, MS organizations really came together and made a collective commitment to a global research strategy, like Bruce just mentioned. And we really recognize that together we can be the most effective when we're working together to address knowledge gaps, avoid duplication, and really ultimately speeding progress towards the cures that are part of Pathways to Cures. And we've made some nice progress since then. We are looking to increase our engagement of other MS organizations beyond the ones that you listed. But our first line of business was to conduct a global landscape analysis to better understand the MS research currently funded by governments and MS advocacy organizations worldwide. So we completed that landscape analysis, and results were recently also published in the MS Journal. So our Pathways to Cures paper that Bruce mentioned and the results of our global landscape were recently published together in the MS Journal. We also presented during several scientific meetings, scientific posters at international MS research conferences, and the results of the landscape analysis will continue to inform our collective work moving forward. We also have been sharing our national research plans and are better organized around addressing the stop, restore, and end pathways more methodically and collaboratively. And we're continuing to collaborate, share information, and fund research and global initiatives.
Bruce, as you mentioned a moment ago, the updated Pathways to Cures roadmap calls out some key foundational factors that will accelerate research progress. For example, the updated Pathways to Cures roadmap calls for lowering barriers to global data sharing. So I have two questions around that. First, how does global data sharing accelerate research progress?
Well, so that is a great question, John. And it was a large topic of conversation at the Global Summit last year in New York. Just like the rest of the world, right? There's tremendous amounts of data being generated all over the world related to the treatment of MS and drug trials, for example, research studies at universities. All of this information is captured in databases, and some of it's being leveraged to learn and get interesting insights into the cause and potential cures of MS. But we could be doing more. And the challenge is there are a lot of challenges to sharing data, both within borders and national borders and between national borders. I think that's your next question, probably, John, or what are the benefits are clear. There's so much data being generated, and there are likely insights in that data that could provide clues to the cause of MS and get us closer to cures. So that's the promise of big data, and that's the promise of sharing data. But what's standing in our way are both technical and I'd say policy issues. So technical issues really include sort of data. And it gets a little bit technical, but it's interoperability. You think about different people have different kinds of databases. They collect it in different fields. They don't talk to each other. The process, John, of taking one large database that has a bunch of data in it and taking another large database and trying to merge them is incredibly complex and technical. And so there's a bunch of technical stuff that has to get worked out. So there are professional organizations, others working on standardizing data collection and standardizing data fields and how we collect them and trying to get better at this interoperability issue. So that's a sort of a technical issue. And the other one's a policy issue. There's an expense for sharing data that oftentimes isn't included in grants to support. So funding agencies will require data sharing, but they often don't provide the funds necessary to make it happen. There's, I think, a security and privacy issues that have to be honored and abided by that also can make it very, very difficult to share data, again, even within countries or certainly between countries. And so this could be solved potentially, John, through advocacy efforts and policy work to try to decrease some of the barriers that governments have put in to protect people's privacies. But I think we have to be careful, right? We have to strike a balance between protecting people's privacy and also being able to share that data to gain insights into MS. So it's a little tricky, but the solutions there are policy solutions and other solutions are more technical.
Well, you managed to answer both the questions I had surrounding that global data sharing piece. Let me ask you something else here. Bruce, armed with the updated research roadmap and a clear overview of most, if not all, of the MS research taking place in the world today, how do we move forward toward enhancing collaboration?
I think in MS, we're really in a unique place because we, and we'll be together next week in ECTRIMS with thousands of MS researchers who, in almost all cases, work really well together and have a common goal of gaining insights that lead to treatments and eventually cures for MS. So I think we have a collegial and collaborative movement. And so we're starting from a place of strength, I think, there. I think the roadmap provides a common language, a framework that everyone can work from. So we're all singing from the same sheet of music, John. And when we use certain terms, people understand what we're saying. And so I think that roadmap is really helping enhance collaboration. Shawna mentioned that the major MS organizations, the major organizations that fund research around the globe, are inspired by Pathways to form a group that are getting together regularly and looking for opportunities to leverage each other's investments, to collaborate more. So the funders are starting to collaborate more. The International Progressive MS Alliance really was the kickoff for this, that made it feel possible that global organizations could work together to accelerate progress. And that trust and confidence and success that we built with the Progressive Alliance is now, again, a starting off point, starting from a place of strength on this topic, John, of moving forward together. So there are a number of, I'd say, nascent ideas for how we can pool resources, collaborate, leverage funding to accelerate progress in certain areas of Pathways. And as those get more mature, we'll be able to say more about them. But I think the alliance in combination with Pathways to Cures has changed the landscape, I'd say, in MS research globally. And this is the era, I think, we're living in of collaboration and coordination.
I'm glad you mentioned the Alliance, Bruce. Our listeners may not know that I first met Bruce and Shawna while I served on the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. The International Progressive MS Alliance is a first-of-its-kind global collaborative response to solving progressive MS. And when I look at the Pathways to Cures Global Research Initiative, it appears to have borrowed some of its DNA from the Progressive MS Alliance. Is that a fair statement, Shawna?
Yes, definitely. And we feel so lucky that you were such an important part of the Alliance. You brought so much to that work, John, so we appreciate you. The International Progressive MS Alliance formed more than 10 years ago when we recognized a significant unmet need related to progressive MS, and that was around the lack of treatments for progressive MS. So working together through the Alliance has meant that we have been intentionally focused in our efforts, have combined financial and staff resources, and brought together truly the best scientists and expertise from around the world. And that really has helped leverage into all of the global work that we're doing all together. I think another key aspect around that is that people affected with MS have also been critical to the success of the Alliance and to all of this global work as well. For example, our people affected by MS engagement coordination team, which you were a member of, have really informed every aspect of our work at the Alliance and offer really critical perspectives and a lived experience around what living with the disease looks like. And so much of that advice and leadership translates into all of our efforts in the global MS movement. So to answer your question, I think the Alliance really has been a good model to demonstrate that we can work together to move things faster and find solutions wherever they are in the world, and not just focus on what's right in front of us, but really make sure that we're all working together. MS is certainly a complex disease that we really can't solve in isolation. So recognizing that we must work together to transform that landscape.
Hey, John, maybe I can add a little comment there. But prior to the Progressive MS Alliance, the National MS Society in the United States has, from its very beginning, always awarded grants agnostic to geography. So we don't care if you live with MS, you don't care where the next insight that leads to a treatment or cure for MS comes from, if it's in, Oregon where I live, or in California where you live, or in England, or where nobody cares. So we've always funded research globally, but the other MS societies have not funded research outside of their borders. So part of interjecting is to share with the audience that the Progressive MS Alliance inspired other MS organizations to fund research outside of their borders for the first time. And it's that trust that we've built with other organizations to be a good steward of those resources that I think is, again, this jumping off point, that we're coming from a position of strength in becoming ever more coordinated and collaborative with our other organizations around the world that fund research.
Well, Bruce, now that this updated research roadmap has been published and we've seen the Pathways to Cures initiative endorsed by more than 30 MS organizations around the world, what happens next?
Yeah, so I think what our hope is that the Pathways to Cures roadmap is a resource that those organizations can use as they're developing their strategies and plans for deploying resources to research that will lead to insights and eventually cures for MS. So we're already seeing this in action, John. The strategic plans of many of the organizations are using the language that we've established in Pathways to Cures. We don't have this copyrighted. Anybody can use the language and use the roadmap to help assist them in developing their strategies and plans for funding research. I think Shawna mentioned earlier this coalition or group of like-minded organizations, global MS organizations around the world, which are now meeting regularly, the CEOs, the executive leadership and research leadership of, I think it's 7 or 8 MS organizations, Shawna, that are meeting monthly, John, to talk about what we're doing and to bring new ideas to the group and work towards collaboratively funding areas of the roadmap we think there are unique opportunities to make advances on. For example, there's types of research that are better performed in other countries, frankly. So we'll deploy resources to those places where we feel like we can accelerate progress. Again, I think it's a new age of collaboration and working together, and we will undoubtedly get to the goal of cures faster by working together.
Well, I think you may have started answering the question I'm about to ask Shawna. Shawna, there are a lot of moving parts to this mission, and they're literally scattered all over the world. How do we keep everyone's foot to the pedal and maintain that level of collaboration that can accelerate progress?
Well, yes, I think in addition to all of us working for the MS movement, we all also have a personal passion to solving MS. So we have so many people that we care about that are impacted by MS. So we just absolutely must be unrelenting. We must continue to work as quickly and as efficiently as we possibly can and remove any barriers that we have to progress. I think we have a lot of hope for the future, and it's exciting to see how the global community continues to come together to move progress forward. We've accomplished so much, but we need more funding. We need continued focus, discipline, and engagement of the MS movement worldwide. So we really must keep pushing as much as we can.
And John, one of the things I think we learned with the Alliance is that early wins are really helpful. So having early success, establishing a goal that's reachable and having an early win, I think helps build momentum. So it's not swinging for the fences right out of the gate, but establishing some early goals that are achievable, that build momentum towards our ultimate goal of curing MS.
Well, Shawna Golden and Bruce Bebo, I want to thank you both for leading all of the work and moving the Pathways to Cures initiative forward and bringing research and ultimately cures for MS within our reach. And thanks so much for talking with me today.
Awesome. Good to be with you, John.
Thanks, John.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/370. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free RealTalk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. And I have some bonus content coming next week. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.